Hi, everyone, and welcome to this live edition of Recruiting Future Roundup. It is brilliant to be back live on LinkedIn again. And obviously, for those of you who are listening on the podcast, you can still listen to the audio recording of this. I didn't get the chance to do a roundup last month, so there are a huge amount of episodes that it will be great to talk about. So I've picked from May and June for us to talk about in this particular roundup, because there's some really, really interesting topics. I am, as ever, joined by a guest co-host. Hi, Ben. How are you?
Hi, Matt. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Could you just quickly introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do?
Sure. So my name is Ben. I am one of the co-founders of Maki People, and I actually run everything tech. So I've been the brain behind the product that many enterprise customers use to screen their candidates and now interview their candidates, but more on that later.
Fantastic. Yeah, tell us a little bit more. So Maki are in the process or have launched a new product. Tell us what it is, what it does, and why you launched it.
Sure. So if you look at the way hiring works, right? It's a sequence of activities and decisions. And for the last few years, we've been focusing on, tackling that sequence one stage at a time. And so we started with assessments. We then moved into skill screening to create immersive job previews and filter out candidates at the very top of the funnel. We launched Mochi, which is our AI interview last year. So we were amongst the first ones to actually have an AI interviewer on the market. And obviously, we also removed friction when it comes to scheduling with a workflow that we called Kumi. But there was always one piece that was left untouched, and it's actually the highest stakes one. That's the human-led interviews, right? And it's where the final decision actually gets made. And what we've been hearing from our customers is that it's been a black box, right? Which questions get asked, how the conversation flows, how each candidate is guided through. None of that is visible from the outside. And so two people actually interviewing for the same role can walk out of a completely different conversation, right? And so this is why we're super happy to release Tomo, which is an interview copilot. And so we co-build with recruiters one structure plan for a role. So the skills to assess, the questions to ask, the signals to look for. And every hiring manager runs that same plan so that every candidate gets the same shot, right? And during that time, Tomo actually sits there. So it records, it transcribes, and it keeps the interviewer on plan with live guidance so that they can stop improvising and really focus on the conversation. And afterwards, what we provide is a structured summary. So the transcript, but it's also a calibrated score where every rating points back to the exact moment in the conversation that it came from. And this is where we actually leverage everything that we've been building thus far, which is our scientific foundation, and I'd be super happy.
Yeah, because it's kind of a complete sort of end-to-end thing now, isn't
Exactly.
it? The interview process. Just sort of run us through the kind of the flow of that, just to give people context.
Yeah. So actually, I think it echoes one of your episodes about orchestration, right? Because once you have all of these different activities, you can connect them together and really start at the very beginning with, let's say, an AI interview where maybe you assess for eligibility criteria, but also maybe a couple of skills, right? You then add on top of that assessment where maybe you go a little bit deeper into some of the skills, right? And then you add 1 to 2 interviews that will look for different or complementary skills, right? And at the end of the road, you actually get that comprehensive picture of the candidate's performance, not only at one single stage, but throughout the entire process, right? So we call that end-to-end orchestration. And we believe that, with a system like Maki, you can really power up hiring intelligence, because all of a sudden you're actually making decisions on signals that make sense and that are going to be predictive.
Absolutely. And as you say, I think there's some of the topics that we're going to get into as we sort of go through the episode. So let's dive in. The first interview I want to talk about is episode 790. Rethinking Work in the Age of AI. It was an interview with Stacey Harris, who's a Chief Research Officer at Sapiens Insight Group. I've been really keen to get Stacey on the podcast for a really long time. She does some great work. She does an annual survey that looks at everything that's happening in HR tech. And in May, I was at HR Tech Europe in Amsterdam. And we recorded this in person. We recorded it standing up in a corridor with no lights because, that's just crazy conference podcasting for you. But it was a really interesting conversation to have. Some of the things that kind of came out of the conversation for me, which I think make it really kind of worth diving into, is really this kind of wave of AI change is different from other technological changes that have sort of hit talent and recruiting, because it's actually making us rethink what work actually is. She also talked about all the layoffs that are happening allegedly because of AI in the tech sector, and really it's interesting in terms of companies that are sort of redeploying people and finding, valuable things for people to be doing if AI is indeed kind of automating and removing some of their tasks. And one of the examples she used is something that IKEA are doing. Ben, what did you think about this sort of particular topic? I suppose particularly in kind of reference to, AI taking tasks away and how employers deal with that.
Yeah. So I think, that's one of the main challenge that we get from customers, which is, okay, look, you're going to introduce, let's say, an AI interviewers, right? So what are our recruiters going to do in the end? And so what we're trying to point out is that, one, it's not super, energizing to actually go through a pile of CVs, especially when they're all written by AI. So, there's probably more value add to add elsewhere. And so what we're suggesting them is that you've got all those boring tasks that are going to become even more boring as AI also, facilitate the work of applying to jobs, right? But at the same time, you could mobilize those people to do something much more interesting, which is, for instance, source candidates, engage them, seduce them, right? And potentially also reduce cost for the company, because we've got a lot of customers that we're actually utilizing their internal resources to, parse through the CVs, but then we're using external agencies to actually do the fun stuff, which is, contacting candidates and sourcing them and so on. So at the end of the day, it's more about how do we sort of rebalance what we're doing and potentially automate some tasks that should be automated, but then leverage humans where they should be leveraged.
And I think the really important thing around this is to have a plan, because I have so many conversations with TA leaders who talk about AI taking admin stuff away, boring jobs, and freeing their teams up to do valuable work. And I think you give them some great examples there. But a lot of the time, people don't know what that valuable work is, or they haven't thought about it. So I think that's kind of a really important thing to work through as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also something that is a little bit more worrying or worrisome for recruiters, especially, right? So when Stacey's mentioned the personal versus process adoption gap, right? I think it's easy to embed AI within one's own work, right? So let's say emails, for instance, but embedding that into a complex workflow where it's about hiring decision, for instance, it's much more complex, because it means that you need to trust something that actually you're going to have to defend to a candidate, to a manager, to a regulator. And I think that the gap also comes from that, which is, how do we actually ensure that the workflows we're about to change are going to be secure, are going to be safe, are going to be compliant?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because one of the things that Stacey kind of flagged up in the conversation was the adoption gap between people using AI personally and people who've embedded it in workflows, and lots of reasons for that. But I think that is a really kind of important point around governance and explainability, and the work that it takes. The work that it takes for big companies to do this kind of change with technology. So yeah, I think that's a really great point.
Actually, that's also one of my hat, which is a sort of compliance officer of Maki, right? And I believe that I spend maybe 30% of my time on those topics. But I think it's important, right? Because again, we're making decisions about people's lives, and so if we don't take that seriously, then who will?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Moving on to the next episode, 791, which I also recorded live at HR Tech in Amsterdam. It's an interview with Melissa Shelley Haujor, who is the head of global HR digitization at H&M Group, if I can say that properly. So second time on the podcast, she came on last year to talk about change management. She's got a really, really interesting job looking at technology and data across HR, across the whole of that global business. And this was a really important conversation that I'm hearing not many people having. And it was all about the data that sits behind this. So as an organization, H&M are keen to have kind of agentic AI workflows across their entire employee lifecycle. But they're kind of acknowledging that to do that, they have to really work hard to, centralize the data, have a foundation around data governance and process design and integration. And it was a really kind of in-depth conversation, but it's not a conversation I'm hearing very often, and it's just incredibly important. Ben, what did you think?
So this touch on what I mentioned at the beginning, which is, orchestration, right? I think indeed mobilizing siloed agents will definitely, accelerate a few tasks, right? But at the end of the day, if you don't connect them together, you're missing the overall picture, right? So I think there are two ways to look at it. The first one is, when you think about hiring, as I've mentioned, it's going to be a succession of stages. And to have the most comprehensive understanding of the candidate, you want to connect the dots, right? You want to make sure that in the interview, you don't reassess for things that have been assessed at the very beginning, right? Imagine that you spent a couple of minutes just checking the eligibility criteria, and then you spend half of the interview with a human revalidating those. It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
So how do we connect the dots in order to make sure that, one, we provide a great candidate experience, but two, we actually try to assess a maximum of things within the entire hiring life cycle. So as I've mentioned, right, this is typically what we're currently building at Maki. And so now that we have all the agents, we're literally releasing what Melissa called the orchestration, which is sort of the foundational layer that powers all of our agents.
And I think one of the things that she talked about, which kind of goes back to what we were saying in the previous interview about valuable tasks and those kind of things, is new roles within HR, within HR, and TA around things like orchestration and technology. Is that something that you see happening? That talent teams, in the clients that you work with, are they evolving? Are new roles appearing? Are new skills needed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's one key dimension that I'm seeing more and more. It's going to be around impact. And I think connecting the dots also goes to talent management. And so there was a natural frontier between the two worlds, right? There's everything about recruitment, and then there's everything about management or development. You call it what you want, right? And now we're seeing more and more that frontier become blurry, because at the end of the day, if you want to measure what happens in the hiring process, you also need to look what happens after, and vice versa, by the way, because mobility is just another hiring process, sort of, right? So what we're seeing more and more is customers actually bridging the gap and connecting the dots between those two worlds.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that really is the path the path that we're going on. Definitely. Let's sort of change gears slightly, move to the next one I want to look at, which is episode 797. It's called Hiring the Humans Behind Robots. Now, I put this one in because it was absolutely fascinating. It's a conversation with Katrine Selesner, who's the talent acquisition lead at Humanoid. And Humanoid make humanoid robots to work in factories, to do industrial work, to do, all kinds of things. And their recruitment needs are kind of the most difficult skill sets to find. They need people who are skilled in robotics, people who are skilled in AI, really, really hard to find skills. So it was really interesting to talk to her about how they find and attract that kind of talent, and how she sort of built out the whole of their TA function from the bottom up in terms of technology and people and all those kind of things. I suppose that is well worth listening to. I suppose that the one thing that I sort of pull out straight away, which I think speaks to something that we were talking about a second ago, is she uses a lot of technology to find these very hard to find people, to understand them, but was very, very clear on the human value here in terms of building relationships and having conversations in order to persuade people to move to their organization. What kind of struck you about that part of it?
So I think, first of all, kudos to her, because what she's managed to build in just 18 months is crazy good. I think that's literally what I was saying at the beginning, right? Which is there's going to be a bunch of roles where you're just inundated with applications flooding in, right? And I think that this is where AI can be super valuable. But again, when it's about finding the candidate that only exists in 3 countries, right? And where you need to approach them, seduce them, and so on, you need to have that human touch, that human magic, right? And so it's all about how do I ensure that I have the capacity to actually do that and to do that at scale? Because again, she was in the context of hyper growth, right?
Yeah.
So you want to protect
Yeah.
those resources at all costs. And it seems that she's managed to do that. So again, kudos to her.
Yeah, and I think I think the other thing I find fascinating about these type of conversations is, how does a startup, a reasonably small startup that is obviously scaling very quickly, how does that tempt talent that could go to the bigger tech companies who inevitably will pay more? And we've heard all kinds of crazy stories about what tech companies are paying for AI kind of professionals and robotics professionals like this, and it's really kind of leaning into the type of work they're doing, what's interesting, who they're working with. And I've sort of heard this from a few AI companies before, and I think it's kind of really interesting, and I think there's lessons here for everyone, particularly when the narrative around this is the sky high salaries that are being offered. What do you think about that part of it?
So I think, and it's funny because we're a little bit in the same line of business, right? So it's very difficult to attract those talents, obviously, and you're fighting with companies that do not necessarily have the same means than you. But I think, it starts with providing a great candidate experience. And so what was fascinating in her story is that for an early startup, the way they organize themselves is honestly fascinating, right? So having structured interviews, scorecards, having a clear source of truth when it comes to the ATS and so on. Honestly, the processes she describes is way better than most of the enterprise customers that we have, right?
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's what's fascinating, because if you have such a good process in place, that leaves a great impression towards candidates. And so obviously, that might makes it easier for them to join you, even though you're not able to compete on the high salaries and so on.
And I think also it underlines the advantage of building something from scratch, from the bottom up for the modern world, rather than having to inherit something or deal with lots of processes that are already there.
That's the beauty of startups, huh?
Absolutely. So the next episode that we're looking at is 799, and I've put this one in because it's a similar problem but approached from a completely different way. So again, it's about skill shortages, completely different industry, completely different type of recruitment. It's an interview with David Dart, who's the Chief People Officer at Caliber Holdings. And we were talking about their company, Caliber Collision. What they do is they're a large kind of a large company of garages across the US that fix cars that have been in collisions. And with the way that cars are now, this is not a simple cookie cutter task. He describes the work as they do as being like artisan in terms of all the variables with different types of car, different types of electronic of EVs, and everything that's going on. So, really difficult skill set to learn. Takes 3 to 5 years to become fully productive as a body technician in this kind of environment. And basically there's a shortage of them. So, getting these people in, getting them trained is a problem. And the interview was sort of diving into the apprenticeship scheme that they've built, the graduates, the people they have coming through it, and also how they then fit into their workforce in terms of the way they're mentored by more experienced people, all this kind of stuff. So they've really sort of gone out there to grow their own talent in a way that obviously is great for them, but it's great for their kind of industry as a whole. And he sort of went on to talk about, how governments could help with, with this type of, with this type of training and hiring. So really interesting conversation. I suppose the thing that, I was kind of struck by is this whole thing about, upskilling people and training people. What were the standout parts for you, Ben?
So I think there are 2 things. The first one is it's great to see industries where, people are AI proof. So that's quite reassuring to me. And I think, when I think about my kids, I'm wondering, what I should tell them in terms of a career trajectory. So the second thing is that, the way we see assessments is that generally it's geared towards recruitment, right? But I was saying at the beginning, development is probably something where it actually adds a lot of value, probably even more. And so that's a key example of how we can use assessments to sort of understand how people master skills, how they're growing up, what potentially we should do in order to train them more. And when you think about mobility, so in that case, it's going to be, graduation, right? But potentially upskilling, reskilling. So how do we measure things as of today? And how do we help people understand where they could go next, depending on what's available within the organization, right? And so really understanding the skills that would help us move people where the organization need them, or move people where they believe that they will realize themselves. So ultimately, that's a new frontier for us as well, because we believe that assessments in hiring is great, but potentially assessments in mobility and development is something that's even greater.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I've got some kind of episodes sort of coming up in the next month or so where we sort of dive into that whole aspect of upskilling and reskilling. And one of the biggest issues around this is this notion of experience. So you have to have experience to learn these skills. And I think that actually, if we start looking at these things scientifically, is that the case? Do we look at how people do learn skills differently? I think that, AI is turning some of the assumptions on the head here, because people, might not be able to get experience in terms of, that sort of time span. So really interesting. I think this is going to be an area that's going to be really disruptive. And I think our thinking is going to certainly evolve on this one.
Absolutely. And I think, when you think about AI, there's probably never been a better learning companion, right? So I can literally teach myself anything as of today, and grow on any dimension that I want. And this is what we do also internally at Maki, which is encourage people to actually, craft things and learn new things, because we believe that it's never been that easy to actually learn new things.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to kind of close a loop on what you're saying about jobs being AI proof. One of the things that we were talking about in this podcast is the technicians who do this job. There's no kind of current route to sort of replace them with AI or robots or anything like that. It's a very highly skilled, hands-on job. But the companies do use a lot of AI in their kind of ordering, anticipating, and modeling, damages from collisions, and how they recruit. So really, really interesting. Brings us on to the last episode we're going to talk about today, which is episode 800. So I was delighted to get to 800 episodes of the podcast, and just want to say a big thank you to everyone who listens to it. That's the reason that I'm still able to do it. Brilliant. Thank you so much for helping me to get to episode 800. Not finished yet. Many, many more to come. So to celebrate episode 800, at the start of May, I went to Atlanta and did one of the opening keynotes at the Recruiting Innovation Summit. And what I did for this episode is I kind of adapted that keynote into a podcast audio form and sort of talked through it as a solo episode. And I don't do many solo episodes, but it was good to do, and maybe I'll do a few more as we kind of move forward. So just to sort of quickly kind of run through this. What I was kind of looking at here is the fact that, there's a very long history in recruiting, and you can trace things like resumes and structured interviews back, decades, in some cases, several hundred years. And really, the recruiting that we look at today, we've really inherited all of those things. We haven't had the chance to start from scratch. And I think in a lot of cases, it makes recruiting quite dysfunctional. And I think that there is this huge opportunity with AI to really rethink everything and make recruiting better for everyone, for candidates, for hiring managers, for recruiters, for the business that people are being recruited for. And really, that's what this was about, with some really interesting examples from history that I'd found, and also talking a little bit about an AI readiness framework that TA could adopt. So, well worth sort of checking it out. It's a really interesting story in there. Ben, what did you think of this one? Am I right about this, or do you have another view?
No, to me, it was the most fascinating one, because this is literally also one of the premise of Maki. And so, short answer, I believe that AI can break recruiting, and I also believe that AI can solve recruiting. So to me, this is the most fascinating debate we can have. One of the things that we keep seeing with our customers is that indeed, at least the application entry point is broken. Right. So especially for high volume jobs where all of a sudden it's never been that easy to apply to jobs. Second, it's never been easier to actually craft all the materials that are needed in order to be the perfect candidate. And so recruiters just, drawn into a sea of CVs that mean literally nothing. Right. Or sometimes they use AI. And so you end up with an AI analyzing another AI. And so all of a sudden everything is broken. Right. So to us, it's really about helping them understand what can be automated, what are the right signals to look at. And by the way, on the CV, I mean, I will die on that, right? But CV was invented by Leonardo da Vinci and we still use it as of today. It hasn't changed. And by every serious scientific research, it's been proven that it's actually less predictive than tossing a coin. Right. So looking at that signal makes no sense. And so this is why we believe that things like AI interviews where we measure skills, skill screening through, job previews and so on is probably the most efficient ways to actually screen candidates because first of all, you will actually filter out the noise from signals. And second, you'll actually be able to measure what counts, which is going to be, the skills, the motivation, as well as the eligibility criteria. So again, we believe that AI can actually solve for that piece, provided that it's well utilized.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's exactly where we are at the moment. And the Leonardo da Vinci thing is really interesting because I'd heard that so many times that Leonardo da Vinci invented the resume, the CV. So listen to this episode because I actually dived into, well, what does that mean? Did he really? And what does that look like? And it's really interesting in terms of what happened and how that's developed. Thank you, Ben, so much for your insightful thoughts around all of this. That is us finished for this particular roundup for June. You please follow Recruiting Future wherever you get your podcast. There are loads more great episodes from May and June that we didn't have time to talk about. And there are some really great conversations coming up over the summer. If you go to recruitingfuture.com, then you can search all the past episodes. You can search by keyword. You can look at all the transcripts, all those kind of things. And you can subscribe to our newsletter that comes out every week. So thank you very much for listening. And we'll be back live again next month. And I'll be back on the podcast in the next episode. Thank you very much.